If you want to understand why ordinary lives diverge so violently over time, do not begin with brilliance. Do not begin with talent. Do not begin with luck. Begin with one quiet question: who learned early enough that a dollar is never just a dollar? That is where the split begins. Most people see money in the present tense: rent, food, fuel, a dinner, a payment, a reward, a little relief after a difficult week. Fine. That is how life feels when you are close to the surface. But wealth is not built at the surface. Wealth is built in the part of the mind that can look at a dollar today and see what that dollar might become if it is left alone long enough to gather returns, and then returns on returns. And then years so numerous the whole thing starts looking almost unfair to people who arrived late. That is the force I want to talk about, not as theory, as destiny. Because if you really understand compounding, not just mathematically but emotionally, your whole life starts to change shape. You stop treating money like a monthly event. You start treating it like planted time. That is the mother line for everything I am about to say. Compounding does not mainly transform lives because it gives extraordinary returns to extraordinary people. It transforms ordinary lives because small, disciplined actions repeated under conditions of patience eventually become large enough that time begins doing more work than effort ever could. That is the line. Read it again. Because once you understand it, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking which stock will save you. You stop asking what trick the rich know. You stop asking why progress feels slow in the beginning, as though slow beginnings were evidence of failure. You start asking a better question. What kinds of choices would look tiny this month and enormous 20 years from now? That is the right question. That is the richer question. That is the question the average person almost never asks until time has already priced the answer against him. I want to start with something uncomfortable. Most people in this country will work for 40 years. They will wake up early. They will stay late. They will say yes when they wanted to say no. They will give the best energy in their body to institutions they do not own. And at the end, a great many of them will still arrive at later life with less than they expected, less than they need, and much less than the effort would suggest they deserved. That is not always because they were foolish. It is often because nobody taught them how money changes shape over time. They were taught how to earn it. They were not taught how to leave it alone. They were taught how to spend it. They were not taught how to plan it. They were taught how to compare salaries. They were not taught how to compare decades. That is why the tragedy feels so ordinary. The people losing this game do not look reckless. They often look responsible. That is what makes it dangerous. Now let me show you the first mechanism. I call it the future cost. The future cost is what happens when a present purchase is not measured by its price today, but by the size of the future it quietly destroys. This is the part the human mind resists. A young person gets a real paycheck for the first time. He upgrades the apartment, he improves the car, he buys the wardrobe that fits the new identity. He tells himself he earned it. He probably did. That is not the problem. The problem is that every dollar spent in the first decades of adult life is not a dollar. It is a seed removed from the ground before it ever had a chance to become a tree. The source material says this directly in its own way. The dollar spent at 22 is not merely a dollar gone, but that dollar plus everything it could have become over the next 40 years. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 45 file, 0 Fay, exactly. That is the future cost. And the reason so few people respect it is that the future cost is invisible on the day of purchase. You buy the nicer thing, you feel the improvement. You do not feel the compound cost. There is no alarm. No one shows up at the door with a spreadsheet telling you what that recurring habit would have become by retirement. The future is too polite to interrupt you. It simply sends the bill later. That is why I want people to think in planted time. An acorn looks trivial, throw it away, nothing happens. Plant it, wait long enough, and it becomes shade structure. Thousands of later acorns, something enormous produced by something once forgettable. The source text uses the acorn and oak tree image for exactly this reason. Compounding is hard to respect when it is small, but obvious once time has turned the invisible work into something massive. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay, that is money too. At first the contribution is small. At first the account is unimpressive. At first the sacrifice feels larger than the visible result. That is not evidence against compounding. That is the signature of compounding in its earliest form. The work happens at the beginning. The visibility comes later. That distinction matters enormously. If you do not understand it, you will spend your 20s trading future trees for present comfort and calling the trade reasonable because nobody around you is using the right measuring stick. That is the future cost. Not a moral lecture, a different form of arithmetic. Now let me take you into the second mechanism. I call it the early years multiplier. This is where compounding becomes almost offensive to people who start late, because the first years matter much more than the lazy mind wants to believe. The source material gives the classic comparison. Two people begin at the same age. One starts investing a modest amount at 22, the other waits until 32 while investing the same amount later, and the first ends up with several times more money. Fay file site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. That result sounds exaggerated to people who do not live inside long timelines. It is not exaggerated, it is sequence. The early years are not valuable because you are richer then. They are valuable because time is richer. Then a contribution made early gets more seasons, more reinvestment, more return on return, more chances to become something larger than its original size. That is what the late starter keeps underestimating. He thinks he is delaying money. In reality, he is delaying years, and years are much harder to replace than dollars. This is why I have always said the best age to begin is the age when beginning still feels unnecessary. That is the cruel joke. When you are young, retirement looks abstract. 30 years sounds like another civilization. $200 feels useful in your pocket. The long-term account feels ghostly. That is exactly why the choice matters most. The person who starts at 22 does not win because he is wiser in every area of life. He wins because he gave time more surface area on which to work. That is the early years multiplier. It is not glamorous, it is just merciless. And I want to say something important here. This is not a sermon about perfection. It is not a sermon that says if you did not begin at 22, the game is over. That would be childish. The point is harsher and more useful than that. The point is that whenever you begin, the years after that moment become sacred. Once you see clearly how much the first decade matters, you stop treating delay as harmless. You stop telling yourself next year is basically the same as this year. It is not this year gets more compounding than next year. That is enough. That is reason enough. Now let me take you into the third mechanism. I call it the panic tax. A lot of people think compounding is mainly defeated by low returns. Wrong. It is more often defeated by frightened behavior. The source material uses the 2020 collapse to illustrate this clearly. A person sees his account fall, moves to cash to wait for stability, and then misses the recovery that follows. Fay file a site, Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. That is not an unusual story. It is one of the central ways people sabotage themselves. The market falls. The body interprets financial loss as danger. The mind becomes very eloquent about caution. The investor sells to stop the pain. Then the pain stops briefly. Then the recovery begins without him. That is the panic tax, not the fall itself, the behavior around the fall. This is why I tell people the market is not merely a machine for allocating capital. It is a machine for exposing temperament. If your strategy only works when prices are kind, then you do not have a strategy. You have a preference for comfort. The market does not pay for comfort. It pays for endurance. That is what the panic tax reveals. The cost of emotional action during periods when the correct move is boring stillness. Now let me say this more sharply. The market does not need you to be fearless. That would be impossible. It needs you to understand that fear is not a signal of truth. Fear is a condition. A painful one, a human one, still not a reliable guide to long-term wealth. The source text is right to insist that downturns are not anomalies, but part of the design, and that the only way a temporary decline becomes permanent damage is when the person exits the process at precisely the wrong time. Fay file a site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. Exactly. The panic tax is paid by the person who treats volatility as betrayal rather than as one of the costs of admission. This is why wealth so often bypasses the clever and lands with the calm. Not because the calm person saw more information, because the calm person refused to rewrite a long process in response to a short period of pain that is rarer than intelligence, much rarer. Now let me take you into the fourth mechanism. I call it the river mind. The source material says that most people think about money as a present tense pool, while the people who build wealth think about it as a river moving toward the future. Fay file a site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. That is one of the most important distinctions in the whole file. A pool thinker asks, what is in the account right now? A river thinker asks, where is this flow headed? And what happens if I keep diverting some of it toward ownership and future security? Those are different minds. The pool mind is always living close to the present. The river mind is always shaping what the present becomes later. This matters because money behavior is not really about money first. It is about time preference. The person who sees only the current month will continuously make sense on a local scale and fail on a lifetime scale. The person who thinks in rivers will sometimes look strange locally and powerful later. That is how compounding changes ordinary lives, not by making people geniuses, by teaching them to stop treating every dollar like an isolated event. When you see money as a river, lunch is not only lunch, it is a recurring diversion. A subscription is not only a convenience, it is a long leak in a channel that could have fed the future. A small automatic monthly contribution is not only a line item, it is a redirection of flow from present consumption to future ownership. That is the river mind. And once you learn it, you cannot unlearn it. You start walking through daily life seeing channels everywhere. This can be annoying socially. Fine, it is still one of the richest ways a person can think, because every life is a flow problem before it becomes a wealth problem. Where is the energy going? Where is the money going? Where is the time going? The future is being built by the answers, whether you acknowledge them or not. Now let me say something harder. The river mind also changes how you view your own career. A job is not only a paycheck, it is a river to skills flow, contacts flow, reputation flows, savings flow, or fail to flow. A person can spend 30 years in a career and end with little because the river was never directed toward ownership. Another person with less status can direct a modest river intelligently and end in a much stronger position. This is why I say compounding is not only about returns, it is about direction the wrong direction. Maintained consistently is still a disaster. The right direction maintained consistently becomes power. Now let me take you into the fifth mechanism. I call it the ordinary builder. The public is addicted to extreme examples. Huge founders, huge fortunes, huge exits, huge risk, huge personalities. That is not how most durable wealth is built. The source material gives the story of Linda, a middle-aged nurse who starts late, starts small, stays consistent, and ends not obscenely rich, but financially secure and dignified. Faye file a site. Faye turn 45, file 0. Faye, I love that example because it restores honesty to the conversation. Compounding is not only for the ambitious ego, it is for the ordinary builder. The person who begins late and still begins. The person who cannot put in thousands but can put in something. The person who does not know all the jargon but understands that regularity beats theatricality. That is who compounding serves beautifully. Because compounding is not elitist, it is indifferent. It does not ask for credentials. It does not ask for genius. It asks for consistency and time. That is why I call this mechanism the ordinary builder. It reminds you that financial security is not reserved for prodigies. It is often built by people who never once looked special in the middle of the process. They were just there contributing, noticing little, giving up little, repeating. That is the thing modern culture despises and real wealth respects, ordinary repetition. And I want to say something here that matters a great deal. Security is not a small goal. People speak as if anything less than dramatic riches is somehow uninspiring. That is foolish. The calm of not being one emergency away from panic is a profound thing. The dignity of options in later life is a profound thing. The ability to say no because you built enough is a profound thing. This is what compounding does for ordinary lives. It does not always create glamour, it creates space, and space is one of the richest things a human being can own. Now let me take you into the sixth mechanism. I call it the delay illusion. This is one of the most expensive lies in personal finance and one of the easiest to believe because it sounds so reasonable. I will start next year. I will start after the raise. I will start once life settles down. I will start when I understand more. I will start when the market feels safer. That is the delay illusion. It turns the present into a waiting room and treats time as if time were neutral. Time is not neutral. Time is either compounding for you or compounding against you. That is the truth. The source material says this in the most direct way possible. The best time to start may have been years ago. But the second best time is today, because the one thing you cannot buy back is time. Faithful site Faye turn 45 file 0 Faye. Exactly. That is why delay is so expensive. Not because waiting looks immoral. Because waiting looks harmless while it quietly removes the most important ingredient from the recipe. Years I have watched people spend enormous emotional energy regretting the past while doing absolutely nothing useful in the present. That is regret acting as procrastination. It is a terrible bargain. The person in his 40s says he should have started at 25. And because the pain of realizing that is sharp, he waits again. The person in her 50s thinks the best years are gone. So she half quits emotionally before she even begins. That is the delay illusion. It persuades you that because the perfect version of the story is unavailable, the useful version is not worth beginning. Wrong. A good tree planted late is still better than no tree at all. A late compounding process is still better than no compounding process. A meaningful later life improvement is still meaningful. The only thing delay does consistently is preserve the exact conditions you claim to dislike. That is why I respect action more than regret. Regret is often sincere. Action is the part that matters. Now let me move to the seventh mechanism. I call it the emotion industry. The source material is very clear that most people do not fail because information is unavailable. It says the deeper problem is emotion, and it notes that much of the financial industry is designed to profit from agitation rather than calm patience. Faithful site Faye turn 45 file 0 Faye. That is one of the truest things in the entire piece. An anxious investor is lucrative. A calm investor is not. If you buy a low-cost broad market fund and sit for 40 years, you may become richer. You will not become nearly as profitable to the people who sell activity that matters, because it means the culture around money is not neutral. It does not simply inform. It provokes. It monetizes urgency. It monetizes fear. It monetizes greed. It monetizes comparison. Everything around you says move. Compounding says stay. Everything around you says check. Compounding says ignore the noise. Everything around you says now. Compounding says later. That is why patience is not merely a virtue. It is almost a rebellion against the entire emotional machinery built to keep you reacting. This is why simple plans matter so much. Not because simple sounds wise, because simple is harder to hijack. A broad, low-cost index fund, a regular schedule, automatic contributions. No constant tinkering. That is not intellectually flashy, it is emotionally armored. The plan survives the industry because the plan refuses the industry's favorite product, your agitation. That is the emotion industry. And once you understand it, you stop asking why being calm feels socially difficult. It feels socially difficult because calm does not feed the machine. That is exactly why you need it. Now let me take you into the eighth mechanism. I call it the long game identity. This is where everything finally becomes personal. You do not win compounding once. You become the type of person who can live in relationship with it. That is different. The source material ends by contrasting two future selves, one that heard the truth and delayed again, and one that planted the acorn and mostly stayed the course until later life felt honestly freer. Fe Felicite, Fe turn 45, file 0 Fe. That is the right ending, because this is not a story about formulas. It is a story about identity. Who are you becoming? A person who reacts, or a person who builds, a person who wants the account to prove something quickly, or a person who is willing to become boring enough that the account eventually grows larger than his need for applause. That is a long game identity. It does not mean perfection, it means direction. It means that when life gets noisy, your first instinct is not to destroy the process. It means that when markets become rude, you do not suddenly forget what the plan was. It means that when you are tempted to spend every improvement immediately, some deeper part of you still remembers the oak tree. That is identity. A person with this identity may still make mistakes, still miss months, still feel fear, still have setbacks. Fine. The point is not spotless execution. The point is that the person returns to the process instead of abandoning it permanently every time life reminds him he is human. That is why I trust identity more than motivation. Motivation burns hot and fades. Identity survives fatigue. Now let me make the identity flip explicit. Most people think compounding changes lives because of the return percentage. That is too small. Compounding changes lives because it changes what ordinary people become capable of if they can stop interrupting it long enough. That is the flip. The market return matters, of course it matters, but the person matters more in the early stages. Can the person leave the money alone? Can the person keep contributing? Can the person think in trees instead of snacks, decades instead of weekends, rivers instead of pools? That is the real question. And when the answer becomes yes often enough, ordinary life begins changing in a very non-ordinary way, not by spectacle, by accumulation. Now, let me bring the operating system together in plain language. First, stop seeing money only in the present tense. Always ask what this dollar could become with time. Second, respect the early years much more than your instincts want to. Third, expect fear and plan around it before it arrives. Fourth, build a river mindset where small ongoing flows matter more than dramatic moments. Fifth, remember that ordinary consistency is powerful enough to change a family line. Sixth, treat delay as expensive even when it sounds reasonable. Seventh, defend your plan from industries and narratives that profit from your restlessness. Eighth, become the kind of person who can stay in relationship with compounding through good years and ugly ones. That is the operating system. Not excitement, not genius, not luck. Time plus behavior. Now, let me put the blade into this as cleanly as I can. How does compounding change ordinary lives? Not by making them glamorous, by making them safer, wider, freer, less desperate, more negotiable, more dignified. It takes the person who would have arrived at later life with anxiety and turns him slowly into someone with options. That is the miracle, not a yacht options. And if you remember nothing else from what I said, remember this. The dollar you spend today is never just a dollar. It is a decision about who gets to own the future version of that money. Plant enough dollars often enough and protect them from your fear, your delay, and your appetite. And one day you will look up and realize something extraordinary happened in complete silence. Your ordinary life became powerful